class, I'm really looking forward to meeting you next week. You'll have lectures like this definitely when we start a new work, and sometimes sort of halfway through, whenever I have something that sort of needs to be more explained than discussed. So this is the first of these lectures, although you probably already heard the one about writing in your book. That one was just sort of instructional. This provides some background on the Odyssey and some sort of tips to help you read it and understand it as you move through this complex and interesting work. There might be some stray references to Agamemnon because I switched up the order of our readings this year, and it used to be you read that first and then this one. I moved it around because I think it's going to work a little bit better for how our papers get written. So if you see those, don't panic. You didn't miss any summer reading or anything like that. But I did re-record some of the slides new for this year so that it's as relevant as it can possibly be to your reading for this week. So the first thing you need to know is the genre we're working in. And you probably know this term, but if you don't, a literary genre is a broad, pretty flexible category, like they don't have super rigid boundaries in most cases, of literary composition. So they group works in several different ways. By form, for example, if it's got meter and rhyme, it's poetry. By content, so what it's about. By length, for example, a short story versus a novel. And by style, so sort of the way it's written. So examples of these are epic, which is what we'll be working with today. That's what the Odyssey is. Drama, so plays, novels, and lyric, which is what most people generally think of as poetry, although some of the other genres can also be in poetry. They can have rhythm and meter as well. The epic, for example, is one of those that is usually written in verse. So lyric poems are usually shorter. Each of these broad genres has several subgroups and categories within it. So, for example, within drama, you've got tragedy and comedy. And then even within each of those, you've got sort of smaller groups. So comedies, you can have a comedy of errors, and you can have a romantic comedy, and you can have a revenge tragedy, and so on and so forth. So they've each got several different flavors, even of all their different subgroups. But what you need to know right now is that these are the broad categories of literary works. The one we're working with now is the epic, and also not everything you read that looks like a book is a novel. I get so many papers every year of kids telling me, well, this novel, the Odyssey is not a novel. The novel wasn't even invented until the 16th century AD. So it is an epic poem. If you're not sure what genre it is and you're not sure what to call it, just call it a work, and that'll cover everything. But to get to the specifics of the genre of an epic, an epic is a long poem about a hero's deeds that defines the ideas and values of a culture. So there are sort of three pieces to this right here. Maybe three or maybe four pieces to this idea of an epic. First is that it centers on a great man, sometimes on a great woman, very rarely. A great man is usually the figure. It's a hero. And it's important that it be about a hero and not, for example, a god necessarily, because they're supposed to be an example. They're supposed to somehow embody the traits that this particular civilization finds valuable, and sometimes the flaws that that particular civilization is susceptible to as well. Epic, at least in its classic form, is also in verse. So the original Greek that the Odyssey is composed in follows a certain rhythmic pattern. And most translations of that, while they won't be in the kind of rhyming, sing-songy poetry that you recognize, do try to imitate that poetic quality of the language. And that's part of the reason why it's broken into those shorter lines rather than running along to the end of the page like a normal novel would do. And then, so the last piece of this first part of the epic is that it's long, and that means that it can be comprehensive. So it generally covers a very wide area of time and space. People travel long distances, they stay places for years at a time. It includes a lot of detail. Epic poems are a great place to learn just about what it was like to live in ancient Greece, the customs and practices of their society. It includes some historical events, some real places. And of course, it incorporates many smaller stories, many sort of little mini episodes within it. Different people will narrate things that happen to them. The hero will go different places and do different things. This is especially true of the Odyssey, more so even than other ancient Greek epics, like, for example, the Iliad, because Odysseus goes so many different places and meets so many different people, and they all have a story to tell him. And also, including the fact that Odysseus himself is a champion liar and comes up with a new fantastic story every time he meets someone he doesn't know. He's got a yarn to tell them, and they're included in the Odyssey for us to read. And so these three qualities, that they center on a great man, they're in verse, so they were actually originally sung in most cases, and that they're comprehensive, have two sort of effects. The first is that it shapes the culture and identity of a people, in this case, the ancient Greeks. It sort of is a mirror to them of what they value. You hold it up and say, look, here's what's important to us. And that's why we tell these stories, and that's why these particular men are our heroes, and why they have these personality traits, and they act the way they do in these particular situations. That's why they have this kind of mission. And as we go through the Odyssey, we'll talk about what it means for ancient Greece, that Odysseus is the kind of man he is, that the people he meets behave in certain ways, and his ultimate mission in the Odyssey, and why that would be such an important mission. It also provides models for them to emulate. It says, these are the people that we want you to be like. These are the people we think are important. Now, that makes it very interesting to read, and it becomes sort of illuminating for this particular culture. But you might ask, like, well, why do we care all that much about what the ancient Greeks thought was important in a society, what they thought a hero should do or be, what they thought the perfect man was like? I'm not an ancient Greek. That information is of limited use to me. Well, the interesting thing about these epics is that as they do this, as they form these heroes, they mimic, in a literary form, universal human experiences. So there's something about the Odyssey that is a pattern that anybody can relate to, even 3,000 years after the culture that produced it, even among people who have little in common with that culture. You know, our whole religious and technological and social worldview has changed from the time of the ancient Greeks. But there's still this idea that we are, all of us, on a journey home. And there are lots of temptations that get in the way. And if we can have the strength to overcome them, we too can make our way home. And that's what I mean when I talk about these universal human experiences. That's why we still read the Odyssey. That's why it's still important and interesting and memorable so very long after it was written. Now, the origins of the Odysseys in particular are not certain, because they are much older than the plays of Aeschylus that we just finished reading. They were obviously written by Homer, who is somebody you've probably heard of, but honestly, besides his name, we know almost nothing about him. Now, all of the earliest stories about Homer mention the fact that he was blind.
and that he was a singer, so he would have sung these songs to his audiences. And in the Odyssey, you'll actually see a couple of different bards, singers of these songs, as you read, who are sort of variants on this figure of Homer himself. But other than that, we really don't know anything about him. People have guessed that, scholars have guessed that the Odyssey was composed in the late 8th or early 7th century BC, so 200 or 300 years before the time of Aeschylus and the dramas we looked at. And even then, at that particular time, that would have been 200 or 300 years after the time of the Trojan War. So it kind of, what Homer is talking about here would have been ancient history by the time that he was composing about it. Now, I've mentioned that these songs were sung. They were spoken, sung, and meant to be heard by people. This is a time in Greece, this late 8th, early 7th century BC, where they're just starting to rediscover how to write again. Greece had gone through kind of a Dark Ages sort of period where they had, in essence, forgotten how to write down their language. So it's just barely emerging. This poem would have been composed and performed entirely from memory. Now, that doesn't mean that Homer had this incredible memory, although doubtless he did, and he just memorized this thing word for word and repeated it every time. There are indications that Homer actually improvised, that in essence he followed the same pattern every time, but that he would kind of change elements as needed as he kind of sang his song. So, for instance, you'll notice these sort of repeated chunks. Like, for instance, when someone shows up at someone's house, the description of what happens: they pour water over his hands, they pull up a shining table, the housekeeper brings appetizers. All of these things, they sound sort of similar. And that's because Homer would use these repeated elements and sort of fit them into the story as he was going along. It also explains some of the variations in setting and time, in that Homer was almost certainly one of many bards, singers who were telling this story. And they would listen to each other, and they would kind of pick up things that they liked, dropped things that they didn't like, and so on, which meant that the geography is not terribly stable. Like, nobody could possibly map out any sort of actual description of the journey Odysseus really takes. If you try and do it, it's just impossible. People have attempted, but no two maps really look the same, because it just doesn't make enough sense. The timing is sometimes off. Like, there are sometimes they have only bronze weapons, other times they have iron weapons, which is something like that came substantially later. So those kind of anachronisms are in there because of the oral origins of the Odyssey. It's not a consistent whole piece of invention like you'd see in a novel, where the whole thing's coming from one person's brain and it's meant to be a consistent story. The Odyssey is a work of art, and Homer clearly did produce a work of genius in assembling it together, but it doesn't work the way a novel works, and if you expect it to work like that, you're going to be disappointed. So that's kind of what's behind how the Odyssey was created as an epic. Now, I just want to look at another example of an ancient Greek epic that you're probably familiar with, namely the Iliad. The Iliad was also composed by Homer. It's the only other work we have by him, almost certainly before he composed the Odyssey. It's sort of like a prequel, but not exactly. It obviously is about the Trojan War. And there are some really interesting differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad is a poem of war. It's about how men fight. And in the Odyssey, although it is clearly, people clearly do fight in it, and it ends in a great big bloody battle scene, it's ultimately a story about peace. How do you rebuild a society after it's been torn apart by a war. The Iliad is about the conflicts that make people die for their honor. The Odyssey is about what happens when you go home. What happens when these heroes who've been scarred in battle need to return to their wives and their children and the people they left behind. And obviously, because it's a story about war, the Iliad's kind of main preoccupation, or one of its main preoccupations, is how to die with honor, what it means to die with honor, and whether it's worth it. The Odyssey is about how to live. All of its main characters, except, of course, the suitors, end up alive. They have to figure out how to come back from a war and how to live in society, how to continue building up the community that they left behind them at home. And finally, the Iliad is almost exclusively a male world. Like, there are a few women in it occasionally, like they fight over women, and Helen makes a brief appearance to say self-deprecating things. Andromache makes a brief and touching appearance, but it's basically a guy's story. Women don't do anything major for the action of the plot, and it's just all about men and their fighting. In the Odyssey, on the other hand, women are incredibly important from the very beginning of it. It's got incredibly strong female characters who drive the plot as much as the men do, if not more so. So the Odyssey is a story about men and women together and their relationships with each other. The dangers of those, and believe me, there are plenty of dangerous women in the Odyssey, and the beauty that can have. The Odyssey is, the only ancient Greek epic that has a beautiful vision of a marriage and what a good marriage looks like. So it's, again, about this sort of foundation of this society, the marriage, the family. How do you put it back together, and how do you create a society that can survive in peace? And those are the differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I know some of you are reading it now for one of your classes, or may have read it in the past. So I just wanted to point out those differences to kind of help you understand how the Odyssey is different. Now let's take a quick look at the opening lines of the Odyssey. Now the opening lines of any epic are always particularly important because they're usually a sort of a very brief little capsule of the entire story. The ancient Greeks didn't believe in spoilers, so they're absolutely willing to give away exactly what's going to happen at the end. So let's take a look. It says, "Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy." Now this "sing to me" opening is what's called an invocation to the muse, and that was a traditional element of epics. They always began this way, and this is the muse of poetic inspiration, right? They were going to sing, they were going to create something, and so they needed the inspiration of the muse of this particular god, and there was a specific muse of epic who would watch over their song. Now, note here that we begin to get a description of Odysseus as a man of twists and turns. It's the first and one of the core sort of characteristics of Odysseus. He's a man of twists and turns. He's tricky. He's crafty. He's hard to understand. And since we were just talking about the Iliad, this is completely opposite of any of the men in the Iliad, who were pretty straightforward and easy to understand. They weren't out to trick anybody. Odysseus, on the other hand, is crafty. And the next few lines tell us a little bit more about him and his goals. "Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home." So what more do we see of him here? One, he's curious. He's an explorer. He wants to see and learn. He doesn't just want to get home, although clearly he does want that very badly. He wants to know about the things he passes, and his desire for knowledge is again one of Odysseus's core traits. But he's also one who suffers, and he has to just endure. But at the same time, and this is sort of a contradictory characteristic, he is not just one who suffers, one who something happens to. He's also a fighter. He fights to save his life and bring his comrades home. But it goes on, but he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. So it's describing, in essence, the failure of his mission to bring his comrades home because of their own recklessness. It blames them right from the beginning. It's all their own fault because they ate the cattle of the sun god, and he wiped from sight the day of their return. This notion of the day of their return, the homecoming, the final homecoming of the warriors after the war, was incredibly important to the Greeks. They called it the nostos. And they even had this whole category of songs and stories called nostoi, which is the story of the hero's homecoming. And the Odyssey is obviously one of these, and it contains many sort of mini nostoi within it. We hear the homecoming story of Nestor, of Menelaus, and of course of Agamemnon, who the play we just read is in essence his nostoi. It's his homecoming story. His obviously ends much worse than Odysseus is done. But in some ways they face similar dangers, and we'll talk about that in class next week. So pay attention to Odysseus' relationship to his own homecoming and what he has to do to keep it in mind as you read. And finally, launch out on his story muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. And this is, again, the traditional ending to this invocation to the muse, to this beginning of an epic poem. They begin in medias res. That means right in the middle of things. And this will tell, and at this point, the bard, the poet, asks the muse, hey, start here. And this one is unusual in that it says, start wherever you want. And that is exactly what the muse does, as we'll see here. So instead of beginning at the beginning and going on till you come to the end, epics usually start in medias res. In the middle of things, the action has already gotten going, and you're kind of dropped right into the middle of it. And that's what happens here. The Odyssey actually begins kind of at year 19 3/4 of Odysseus' 20-year absence. He's almost home, actually, at the point that the book starts. The book actually starts by focusing on Telemachus, and who goes on a trip to look for his father. And that's what's described in books 1 to 4. Kind of meanwhile, that's around the same time that Odysseus finally escapes from the 7 years, approximately, he's been stuck on an island with Calypso, and that's described in books 5 to 8. So this all happens right before he actually comes back in year 20. But then, what's unusual about this is that book 9 jumps all the way back to year 10. And Odysseus tells the story of how he got there, everything that happened from the end of the Trojan War through to his escape from Calypso. And 3 of those years are in books 9 to 12. And that's probably what you think of when you think of the Odyssey. Those are the stories you heard when you were younger. That has the Cyclops in it. That has Scylla and Charybdis. That has the Sirens. That has Circe. That has the trip to the underworld. All of the exciting things that you think of when you think of the Odyssey are in those 4 books right there. And actually, he spends 7 years doing nothing at all but sitting on an island and kind of crying about it with Calypso, who won't let him go. So the bulk of his 10-year journey home is actually spent kind of sitting around, not having adventures. But after he describes those adventures in books 9 to 12, the rest of the epic describes how Odysseus and also Telemachus return home and kill all the suitors and sort of set things to right back in Ithaca. So actually, since the Odyssey has 24 books, more than half of it, or about half of it, is spent after he gets back home to Ithaca, which means that the focus is not just, hey, look at this crazy trip Odysseus took. The crazy trip Odysseus took is only half the book. The other half is sort of setting to rights what's gone wrong in Ithaca. And that's one of the questions I want you to think about for our discussion next week. What is so bad in Ithaca? Why is this problem so bad? Why does Telemachus need to go on a journey so he can come back and sort of join up with his dad for this mission of killing the suitors? What makes the suitors so dangerous? I want you to think about that. We'll talk about that next week, and I'll see you then.